from Hydromantis, and I'm welcoming you today to our webinar on using the GPSX scenario function. This is actually the last webinar that we're doing for 2013. We'll be starting up again after the holidays in January, and we'll be posting a new set of topics. And so I'll give you a bit more information on that later on. But for now, we're going to talk about using the GPSX scenario function and using that to sort of manage the data input and output from your model, and also using some of the new features that we've built into our scenario functions over the last couple releases of GPSX. So my name is Spencer Snolling. I'm Vice President of Business and Product Development, and I've been the lead developer of GPSX for the past 12 years or so. And I decided that we wanted to do a webinar on using the scenario function in GPSX because I think it's a feature that gets overlooked a lot. It's very valuable, and I think for people who have been using GPSX for some time, you're probably already familiar with it, but sometimes it's a bit difficult for new users of our software to immediately see how they can incorporate it into their work and how it will be beneficial. So what we're going to do today is this will be actually a fairly short webinar, is just discuss what scenarios are, how you use them, and then give you a couple examples of how to set those up and what people are using them for currently in their work. If you have any questions along the way, by the way, please feel free to type them in the questions box that's part of your GoToWebinar dashboard there, and I'll collect those up and answer the questions at the end of the session. Okay, so as far as using scenarios is concerned in GPSX, these are functions that are there primarily to help you manage different scenarios that you want to run. So you've already built your model, and now you want to put some input into the model and try and do a simulation. And you want to be able to set up a number of different simulation scenarios that could represent different loadings, different operating conditions. Those are things that you could always do in GPSX by making changes to what the values are in the menu and then rebuilding your model. But as you'll see, this is a handy tool for being able to group a number of parameter changes together under a specific name. So this allows you a very easy way to use one base model. So you develop one model, one layout of your wastewater treatment plant, but then you use that as sort of the base value for all your default values for the loading and so on. And then you can create scenarios that represent different situations that you want to be able to simulate, but you always have the ability to flip back to your default at any time. So as I mentioned, sometimes it's not obvious to new users why this is a valuable thing, but you'll see shortly as we go through this exercise today how this can be used. And we've added a couple of new features to our scenarios. If it's not ones that maybe you haven't noticed before, they've been added to a couple of the different menus that allow you to do different things, particularly with file management. So let's start out by talking about what is a scenario. So in GPSX, when you're in simulation mode, you've already developed your model and it's running and you're happy with it. You want to be able to run different simulations to investigate different aspects of the behavior of your plant. So a scenario is a collection of inputs that are grouped together under a single name. And so these are parameter changes that you're going to make in one or more menus throughout your plants. And can also incorporate data files that you're using for dynamic simulations. When you have a file input controller that is potentially reading something like influent flow over a period of time, you may want to have several different versions of that file ready, and then you can associate them with different scenarios. So all of the scenarios are managed from the scenario menu in the middle of the simulation taskbar at the bottom of the screen when you're in simulation mode. So just next to the part where you type in what your stop time is for your simulation, you have this what is showing as default scenario when you first switch over to simulation mode. As you create new scenarios and you use them, whatever is the current scenario will show in this space on the tab bar. So as I mentioned, the reason that we're doing this is it allows you to very easily flip between different sets of input. Now, you could have always done this by going back to modeling mode in GPSX and making changes in some of these menus and entering in new values and then rebuilding that model and going back and forth doing that. that can become quite tedious, especially if you have a large number of parameter changes in many different menus. So for example, if you were had a scenario where you would like to take part of your plant out of service, that may involve setting some tank sizes to 0. That's the conventional way to remove a tank from service. Therefore, you may need to also switch over a number of controllers and other kinds of splitters. You may need to change some pump flow rates and so on. These are a large number of parameter settings that are going to be spread across several different objects in your layout. So if you want to go back and forth between running different kinds of scenarios in order to be able to compare your default situation with this new proposed operation, that may make it difficult for you to do that very efficiently. So you also may have different dynamic data sets. Say, for example, if you had a number of different wet weather events, or you wanted to compare dry weather flow versus wet weather flow for a dynamic event, you don't want to have to be continually swapping files back and forth. So you now have the scenario that can handle that for you. Anytime basically where you need to make a number of frequent changes on those menus, taking things in and out of service and so on, if you need to do that on a regular basis, you're comparing things back and forth, scenarios are a nice handy way to do that rather than going back to modeling mode and changing things back and forth and rebuilding each time. So a scenario is a set of temporary parameter changes across the board, across all those different objects, and you give it a name and you save those temporary changes to that particular scenario name. So all other parameters, the ones that you have not touched, are basically kept at the values that you built into the layout. Those may be GPSX default values or even values that you've entered in and saved and then built into that layout. Once it's in once it's in simulation mode, you can then do these scenarios to just give it a temporary change. The nice thing is once you've set up a few of them, you can easily flip back and forth between any scenario. They'll always be there. They're saved along with your layout, and they'll always be there for you to use in the future. And by definition, you've seen here as in my earlier screenshot, the default scenario is essentially what you built into the layout before you made any further changes. So the values in those scenarios, they can be easily edited, changed, deleted, printed, and are copied and pasted into an Excel spreadsheet. Individual scenarios can then actually be built right into your layout. If you decide that the scenario that I've got now, I'm happy with it, I want this to become my default scenario all the time, you can then, there's an automatic feature to be able to do that for you. When you're creating new scenarios, you can build them off of other scenarios. You can sort of say, I want to use this, particular operational scenario that I have. I want to start with that, and then I also want to make it a winter scenario. So I'm going to take the operational scenario changes and then build upon that to change my influent flow and concentrations and temperature and so on. So let's hop over to the software now and take a look at how you actually create a scenario. So I'm going to start with one of the examples that comes on our CD after you install the software. You can always go to the File, Sample Layouts menu and select from any number of layouts that we already have put together for you. Today I'm looking at this conventional activated sludge with the solids handling line. So that's the one that I'm dealing with right now. It does not have any scenarios built into it by default. Some of our other ones do. So just to take a look at that scenario function now. So down here at the bottom of the screen, I'm pointing at this default scenario menu. So if you pop that up, you can see that we have the option to make a new one. We can configure some data files. We can select from the available scenarios. Of course, right now the only one is available is the default one. So just to show you what we mean here, if I open up one of these menus for this particular object, you'll see that I can't enter any new numbers at this point. Everything is grayed out. This is the default scenario. You cannot change the default scenario by itself other than going back to modeling mode and making changes and rebuilding that Fortran code again. So what we're going to do then is we are going to make a new scenario, and I'm going to call this one summer temperature, just for fun. And I hit accept, and then now you'll notice that that's been selected as our scenario that we're currently using. There's the default that we had before, and this is the summer temperature. So now when I go back to that same menu, you'll notice I can make changes. So one of them, I'm just going to go around and make a few changes here, typical things you might want to do. I'm going to turn on a DO controller. I'm going to make the front end of this tank anoxic just for fun. And let's change the influent flow a little bit. Let's knock that down a little bit. And since it was a summer scenario, we may want to change the liquid temperature here to be a little higher than what we would normally have, and so on. So those are a couple of the changes that you might typically see. We may also change things like RAS rate or the influent characteristics themselves, so the concentration of COD and ammonia and so on. So what we've done now is we now have a simulation where we're going to use that base set of values that the layout was built with, plus those 3 or 4 changes that I had. And we can always flip back to that default scenario at any time. If I go to this show menu here, you can see some of those changes that I made. These are, in fact, the only changes away from what was our original default scenario. So I'll come back to this menu a little bit later on. So that's how you basically set one up. So now we can see here I've got no DO at the front of the tank, and with that higher temperature and a few other things going on without any other changes. You know, I'm not actually nitrifying here too much anymore. But we can flip back to the default scenario. So I don't have to go back to all those menus. If I go back and take a look at any one of those menus as I did before, we're back to our original default values. If I flip back to the summer one, we can look at this menu again. We can see that value has been changed. So if I go back to my default and I run that simulation, we can see that we'll have full use of our dissolved oxygen here, and now we are doing well, pretty close to full nitrification. So again, that's an idea here where I have my default scenario, and then I switched it to this other summer scenario, and I made a whole bunch of operational changes. And you can see that that's a nice, easy way to flip back and forth without having to open up a lot of menus every time. Okay, so let's go back to our slides here. So there are a few rules and a few ways that we apply the scenario values, so that you're clear. Whenever you're opening up a menu and you are making some changes as part of a scenario, you will see that those scenarios always show up in green. The values on the menu always show up in green. So first of all, you'll note that if something's in black, that's our GPSX default value. And anytime you make a change to that value, we highlight it in blue. So you can tell the things that you've changed away from the default. Now that's during the step when you were building the model in modeling mode. And then if you choose to create a scenario, this list of temporary parameter changes, they will show up in green. So it's a nice, easy way to sort of separate out things from each other, that you can tell which are the values that I built into my layout and which are the values that are part of the current scenario. So what happens when you have that particular parameter up on a slider or up on a file input controller? So that, by the way, just to be clear about the terminology, I'm talking about what happens when you have this slider up here, and what happens when this influent flow is also part of my scenario. So the answer to that is that the slider values, the values that are showing up on the screen, will always take precedence over the scenario values that you entered into your menu. But if you do change scenarios, or if you make changes to those scenarios themselves, the sliders will be reset to those new scenario values. So the easiest way to explain that is to just show you what I mean there. So as you remember, I made this new scenario here, my summer scenario, and I changed the influent flow down a little bit. So right now we can see that it's 2000, and if I flip over to that new scenario where I had entered in 1800, we can see that it's now changed the value that shows in this menu, 1800, as we asked. So it's in green, as I mentioned before. But also notice up here on the influent flow slider, it has changed that value. Now, if you were to run a simulation and make a change to that, that is, of course, this is the value, this 3390 is the number that's going to be used in the simulation. But anytime I flip back and forth between scenarios, it's going to reset my slider for me to the current value in that scenario. So that's something to keep in mind, and it also helps to sort of keep your simulations organized and know which kind of simulation that you're working with. The good news is that if you want to actually change a value in a scenario, you can at any point say, well, I know this number here. I like these values I've been playing around with these. I can use this button right here. Oh, pardon me. Where is it here? Where is the, oh, I'm sorry, it's down here. Transfer controls to the scenario. That means it's going to take these numbers here and pass them directly into the scenario for you. So I'll do that now, and then I'll go to my show menu, and you'll notice here that it has changed that influent flow to the value that was showing on the slider here for me. So that's a way to sort of handily move things around to be able to pass information to and from the scenario, which is actually where I was going with my next slide. So you'll note that there are a number of features that are used with these scenarios that will make your life easier. Most of those are involved around, as I just showed you, moving parameter values to and from the scenarios themselves. Also being able to excuse me, export and print the scenario values that you have stored as part of your work, and also to be able to associate dynamic data sets with those particular scenarios. So all of this comes from the scenario menu itself. Once you've selected a particular scenario, you can use the show menu item, as I just mentioned earlier, and it will show you a menu like this that shows you all of the scenario values that you have changed that are saved under this particular scenario name. And the good thing about this is that this can be spread across many, many different menus, but you see a nice concise summary here of the things that you changed for this particular scenario. Now you'll notice it's got a number of features, other features and buttons across the top here. The good thing to know is that, first of all, for all of those different options, you can either select or deselect them all. You can delete a number of those directly from this scenario, and they'll go back. They will by default go back to their values that you built into the layout. You can also take a new value of the scenario that you like, and you can move it directly into the layout itself. So it will remove it from the scenario, it'll pass it into the menu, and then it'll automatically rebuild all the Fortran code for you with that new value as the default. Another couple features that are handy here on the end are the ability to automatically copy the names and values onto the clipboard so that you can paste them into Excel. This is we find very handy for when you're writing up a report that you have prepared a model for someone and you want to illustrate for a particular scenario what are the values that are being changed. So you've now got this particular scenario done, and say that's one that you're very happy with. I'm going to open Excel, and I'm going to use this button right here, which is the copy button, copy that information to a clipboard, and I'm going to paste it directly here, and we can see that all of those values that we saved as part of that summer scenario are there, and that can be automatically converted into a nice looking table for your report. Okay, we also have options for printing your scenario. So essentially it's going to just graphically print to printer or to a PDF, whatever you like, that menu that we were just showing you earlier. And lastly, there's the option to associate dynamic data sets with your particular scenario. And this is very handy if you're trying to run different types of wet weather events, or maybe run simulations for different times of the year, and you have data such as the temperature and the flow and the concentrations for your influent and so on. If you were using file input controllers like this, where these things change over time as the simulation runs along, you can use the configuration menu as part of the that simulation scenario to associate a particular data file with the scenario that you've currently got selected. So you do that, it brings up this menu here, and this is our scenario configuration. First of all, I'll mention, by the way, we now have, this is something new, the ability to organize your scenarios in the order that you want to be able to see them. Previously, they'd always sort of gone in chronological order as you created them. Now you can go back in after the fact and use these up-down buttons here to reorder them. So then once you're done, if you want to add a dynamic data set to your particular scenario so that it can be used by your file input controllers, you click on this data file button, and it will bring up a new menu here which has a browser. If you hit add, it will bring up the option to browse through your files in order to find the data set that you like. So for example here, we're going to use, this is actually showing from tutorial 4, which is the tutorial on how to use data input and output in GPSX. We browsed around on our computer until we found this particular data file. This is an Excel spreadsheet. As you may know, you can use either Excel formats or text file formats in order to be able to read data into GPSX. And so in this case, you hit add, you browse to this, and you can add as many of these as you like. You can remove them as needed, and edit will bring up the Excel spreadsheet in this case for me to be able to edit the actual values in that data set. So once that's done, you hit accept, and then now that particular file will be used when you have selected the particular scenario that you have associated it with. It's a nice, easy way to flip it back and forth and manage all your data for your simulations so that you are using the correct data set at the correct time and you don't have to do a lot of swapping back and forth. Okay, so just lastly here, I'll mention that a few typical uses of scenarios in GPSX. These are ones that I've done for many projects that I've worked on, and I know that our clients are using them. Obviously, different loading scenarios. In fact, some of the examples that we have as part of our tutorials, or even part of the layouts that come when you do the installation. Therefore, it's a nice way to sort of set up a summer scenario, winter scenario, where you change the influent flow, the characteristics of that flow, and then the temperature so that you can reflect the cold weather as needed. It also is very useful if you want to be able to compare a plant, its current usage, with what it would look like if it had been expanded. So you might think that that would require you to make two different models, one where the plant is in its current format and then one that is after the expansion has been built. But quite frequently what we actually do is build the full plant, including its expansion, and then we make scenarios to represent those two situations. So you put those extra tankages on there, for example, put the extra tanks there, and then in a scenario you will say, this is my pre-expansion scenario. You will go in, make the changes to the splitters and so on that control the flow to those tanks, and you will set the volumes of those tanks to 0. And then that's how you effectively take them out of service. And so that's your plant running without its expansion, and then have another scenario where you bring all those things back online. So this is very handy because you can then keep all of your simulations into one GPSX layout file. You don't need to have two files running side by side, and anytime you want to make other changes to that layout, you can do that once and not have to do it twice in two different sets of GPSX models. Quite frequently we use scenarios for doing model calibration as we go through and we're trying to make adjustments to the influent characterization. We can add those things and build up a calibrated scenario, and then potentially sometimes also when you're done and you feel you're happy with that calibration, build that scenario in as now your permanent new default. And then quite frequently we have operational scenarios where people put together scenarios that represent step feeding or taking things out of service, or different ways of operating the plant under different control strategies. You can have one plant model that was built once, but then you can operate all those different scenarios from all those different strategies from different scenarios that you've pulled together by making the operational changes for each one of those situations and saving them under a scenario name. Okay, so that's basically a summary of what scenarios do. I encourage you to try them out if you're not already using them on a regular basis. If you have any questions, please feel free to give us a shout. I know that we touch on scenarios briefly at the end of tutorial 2, if that's something that you would like to try out in full detail, about making a temporary change, saving it under a new name, and then working with those scenarios to be able to manage that input effectively.
Thank you for watching this video. If you're interested in information on our other software products, such as CapDebtWorks for preliminary design and costing, ToxChem for industrial wastewater treatment modeling, or WattPro for drinking water treatment modeling, you can visit our website at www.hydromantis.com for further information.